With Blue Key right around the corner, I have 5 updates. First one is this document. I've written an article and a theory shell that you can use against people who copy entire contentions from my prep. The point of this is to deter people from just copying my prep. I think that the only way that prepping a bunch and putting it online for public use could backfire and hurt PF in any way is if everyone just starts copying that instead of doing their own prep. That would be bad, and it's not something that I want. So I've written this so that hopefully people don't end up doing that. So first, I guess we can look at the article. I just wrote this on Medium. I guess this shows you that Medium is not a very good source because anyone can write on it and publish an article, even me. But I've written this article. It's got my position. It's also got like some examples of what I would consider violations of what I want and not violations of what I want. So it can help you if you are running theory to determine what you think is a violation or not and beat some of the arguments that are like, yeah, we don't violate because we cut out a few words from the cards, so we didn't actually copy it. It's also got a lot of different arguments for why people should not copy it, and responses to possible counter arguments like, doesn't the wiki make this inevitable? Or what if people don't have time to do their own prep? Um, and I guess I should reiterate, I don't want people to like bait anyone into theory rounds. I think usually theory rounds are not very good. If you could avoid them, that would be good because then you can have more discussion about the topic. And so hopefully no one like intentionally waits for their opponent to copy me and then uses this. If it's at all avoidable, like if they've got their wiki disclosure up and it's clearly my stuff, you should ask them before the round, like, hey, could you change this in some transformative way to make it unique so that we don't have to run theory on you? And that would be a good thing to do. I've also written the shell itself. It's written pretty inefficiently in full shell format. I actually generally prefer that theory is written in paragraph format. Like debaters should not copy full contentions from Mac's YouTube channel. They did. It's bad because it hurts education and fairness, and here's why. I think that's more efficient and honestly easier to understand than all this jargon with A is the interpretation, B is the violation, etc. But I've written it this way so that you can run it if you want against people who might be copying my contentions. And I've got some responses here as well against some possible responses that people might make. The obvious one is like, well, wait, didn't you copy that theory shell? So isn't it the same exact thing? Maybe it's like a performative contradiction or a perf con. I think there are 3 pretty good responses to that. And also, people will probably say, oh, it's unclear what the bright line is on what violates it. And maybe we don't technically violate because we cut out a word or two. I've made this clear in the Medium article, what I consider to be violations, but also I have like a theory argument here for why you should evaluate the spirit of the interpretation on reasonable terms instead of the direct text of the interpretation. Although obviously this is something that's debatable. So hopefully this is enough that I can put this here to deter people from copying my stuff, and it will never have to be used. The second update is I've added this document to my prep folder. It is an author profile of Charles Glaser, who, if you don't know, is the main author of what I call the Glaser Aff. It's an argument that says, well, China is going to invade Taiwan inevitably. Our deterrence is not going to be enough to stop them. And so either China will invade while we are there and we will protect them, and that will cause a terrible nuclear war, or China will invade while we're not there, and it will be bad, but it won't be as bad because the US will not defend Taiwan with nuclear weapons, and there won't be a possibility as much of a wider conflict. A lot of people think this argument is wrong, and so the profile is this. It has 3 sections. First is all of the articles that Glaser has written in chronological order, with the most recent ones at the top, on the topic of Taiwan. Second is all of the responses that people have written. So all of the articles that people have written that call Glaser out for bad logic or disagree with him for any reason. And there have been a lot of them, responses to different articles that he's written. So here are the most recent ones. There are 2 good articles that respond to his 2021 article, but people have long debated Glaser on all of his takes, which have been repeated throughout the years. He originally, by the way, had a take in the mid 2010s that we should have a grand bargain with China, where we give up Taiwan in exchange for them giving up some things in the South China Sea, for example. He no longer believes that that's possible because relations between Washington and Beijing have soured, which is what he makes clear in his 2021 article. But I want to make that distinction clear because some people might make arguments or references to this kind of quid pro quo bargain that he originally was defending in the 2010s. He no longer has that position. And then the final part of this is it comes from his website, all of his recent China-related publications, in, I guess, also chronological order with the most recent ones at the top. So if you want to learn more about this author, I think he will be somewhat often cited. At the very least, a lot of authors that will be often cited will cite him, or at least take inspiration from him. He is an important context for the overall debate about military support for Taiwan, given that a lot of authors just don't write about reducing military support for Taiwan because it's not very popular in Congress. So why would you write about it? But he is one that actually has written about it directly. And so a lot of that literature will refer back to him. It's good to know where he stands. Cool. The third update is I've written a new contention. Yay, for the Aff. A lot of people have been complaining that the Aff is a worse side than the neg, and it's maybe harder to prepare for than the neg is. I'm sympathetic to this view. I think that it's true that there just aren't a lot of people who are arguing that we should reduce military support for Taiwan, and probably for good reason. I'm in Taiwan right now. A lot of people that I've talked to, and myself as well, we kind of all agree. We don't want the US to reduce military support for Taiwan. It's not a very popular position in like the policy world, in the politics world, or in Taiwan either. Or in the world of scholarship in terms of what people are writing about. And so it may seem that it is more difficult to defend the affirmative. And I would say this is especially true for like lay rounds. That said, I think there are a lot of good Aff arguments that you can spin into convincing narratives if you just prepare it carefully and approach it from a nuanced perspective. So this is one argument. This is actually, I think, probably the best affirmative argument on the topic, which is about relations with China. I think it's the best because it is both the truest, in my opinion, and potentially has the greatest magnitude, or at least the greatest flexibility as an impact with the weighing that you can use once you've won the scenario. Any responses on the link level to an argument about how reducing US military support with China will improve relations between the two countries are probably going to be mitigatory. The only other answers would be turns, which I don't think will be very convincing. Like your link will probably, hopefully, if you do it right, outweigh the turns in most cases, because the turns will be premised on long chains of logic. Like if we reduced US military support for Taiwan, then this other thing will happen, and then that will make China more angry against the US. But I think that these are much less direct and much less likely to be the case than the direct effect that's very intuitive of having some concession to China cause relations to thaw a little bit and warm up so that we can actually cooperate more with them, which makes a lot of sense as an argument. And it seems it's empirically proven as well. So there are a million different scenarios that you can read under the subheading of like relations with China. People will probably read things about technology cooperation, about health cooperation, about climate change cooperation. That's a very favorite scenario for PFers. And a million other things as well. Like multilateralism in general links into a ton of different impacts across the entire world. And it's very possible that cooperation between the US and China can set the stage for broader cooperation with other allies as well, and decrease tensions that might lead to war scenarios across other parts of the world. So it's a very broad sort of argument that will likely link into a number of different scenarios. So it has good weighing because it's very versatile. This particular scenario I've written is about arms control. The reason that I've written it about arms control in particular, and not something like climate change, is because I think that it is harder to weigh climate change against something like a China war scenario, especially since you will always be fighting against the prerequisite. Like if they win that China is more likely to go to war and that drags the US in, for instance, then that will also uplayer your argument about US-China relations because it will be a reason that they will sour because of the eventual consequences of reducing US military support for Taiwan. So this argument is strategically situated such that it is intending to also prevent the argument about China going to war from being true in the first place. and potentially have a better link into that scenario up front than having to fight for the link into relations from behind when they have a pretty strong link into the US-China war. Okay, what is the argument? The argument starts with uniqueness, that arms sales to Taiwan have been getting in the way of lots of different arms control talks, especially things like nuclear talks. What even are nuclear talks? It's a little bit unclear. Maybe different declarations that China and the US will stop targeting each other with their nuclear weapons. Maybe something like disarmament to some extent, like we should at least stop increasing our nuclear arsenals as quickly. Also, things like the establishment of hotlines in the case of nuclear accidents, so that accidents do not have to translate into war and miscalculation. And a lot of other things like changes in the postures of nuclear weapons that might also reduce the chances of war. Those things have happened in sort of spurts across history, but are not happening now. And a lot of the times that they've been stopped have been as a result of US military support for Taiwan, especially most recently in July of this year. Then there's a bunch of older cards that establish some historical precedent for this link. They talk about, I use this term diplomatic capital a lot because it comes up in a few of the different cards, and especially because this card right here says, with enough diplomatic capital, a similar but more important pledge could be made today, which implies that there's a direct link to solvency. If we recover our diplomatic capital by stopping military support for Taiwan and making some concessions to Beijing that allow them to come to the negotiating table or encourage them to come to the negotiating table, believing that the US is more, will follow through on the commitments that it makes there. And then finally, we have a pretty big impact card that talks about nuclear talks hotlines, which are military to military cooperation, as well as even talks on the regulations of the development of AI as it pertains to national security, which is a whole other impact scenario that we can talk about. But mostly this has a link into preventing nuclear war. It says it pretty clearly here that there's a formula for arms races that could end in a lot of miscalculations, accidents, triggering a global crisis with few off-ramps, for example. So the only way that we can really solve this in a structural way, which potentially also solves the scenario that the neg might go for vis-a-vis China, is with greater talks. And that requires higher diplomatic capital and warmer relations between the US and China, which might be like a likely result of the Aff. So interesting argument. I think it's got good literature, definitely worth exploring, but you should recut it if you want to run it yourself. The fourth update I have for you today is I've just written today, just this morning for me, which is, I guess, the night for you if you're in the US. I've written this document, which has a number of different cards that describe the probability of war between the US and China and the probability of war between China and Taiwan, or an invasion of Taiwan, within the next year or within the next decade. And mostly, you can see from just the tags that most of them conclude neg. Most of them conclude that there is not a very high chance of war in the next year, and maybe not even within the next decade. So there is not as much reason to fear as the Aff might have you believe. A lot of Aff scenarios will read this evidence that I mentioned to you earlier in another video about how US-China war might come in 2025. There's other evidence as well that suggests that a US-China war might come in 2027 or 2028 that's quite popular. You'll see those timelines thrown around a lot, especially within the military. Like a lot of writers who are embedded within military affairs or who have had positions that relate to the military in the US government have written about how there's a possibility, they're estimating a timeline where China might feel the need to invade Taiwan by 2027 or 2028. The most crazy one that is the soonest is this 2025 deadline. It is probably not true. So I want to point out, one, where this came from, and two, some context of people who have responded to it. So there's this guy named Mike, who is a 4-star general. So I guess he has some credibility because he's in the US military and he has high ranking, but that's about it. He doesn't really have any other reason to be an authoritative speaker on when China would invade Taiwan. But he says that because of the Thucydides trap, it is likely his gut tells him that we will fight in 2025. He has no evidence for this whatsoever, except for his gut. So take that with a heavy heaping of salt. Even more so, there are a lot of cards, and this is just true regardless of cards. It is a lot of different military thinkers and journalists and analysts have come out saying this guy is full of it. He is incorrect, and what he has said is like a dangerous thing to have said, and he's probably wrong. The Pentagon, for example, immediately distanced itself from his prediction. The Air Force has also come out and distanced itself from his prediction, with some of his even coworkers and colleagues, or even higher ups, saying that probably he is wrong. And more so, even if he's not wrong, he was not in a position to be saying this. He doesn't actually know for sure. No one can be sure when China might invade Taiwan or if it is likely in the near future. Wow. There's a lot of wind outside. You might be able to hear it because we are currently in a typhoon in Taiwan, which is pretty cool. Okay, so that's an insight perhaps to this 2025 timeline. The 2027, 2028 timelines are maybe slightly more credible. A lot of people like Hellbrands, for example, they talk about different clocks that sort of converge around this period of 2027, 2028. One of the clocks is a decline in US military dominance. For example, some of our submarines and other assets might age such that they'll be phased out around 2027 and we'll be on the back foot. There'll be a gap in our capabilities that we will have to take longer to restore, which gives a window of opportunity for China to invade without as much deterrence. A second clock is Xi Jinping is getting older, and he has sort of promised that he will take Taiwan, within his administration. He's at least made statements and speeches like, we should not keep passing this to the next generation, which kind of implies this. A third clock is China's own military modernization is expected to kind of peak around 2027. And there are some other clocks as well. Xi Jinping told his troops to be prepared around 2027, 2028, and to make plans that will accumulate around those times. So those are good reasons that there might be reason to expect that if a Chinese invasion of Taiwan did happen, it would probably be in a few years. However, there is a lot of analysis that just disagrees with that entirely, that says actually it is unlikely, maybe ever, at the very least, it is unlikely soon, that there will be any invasion of Taiwan by China. These articles also talk about the uniqueness about US-China war more broadly, whether that be caused by Taiwan or the South China Sea or any other escalation scenario. And they all basically conclude the same thing, which is that the chance seems pretty low. So this article is one of two that I think are very good on this issue. It does a survey of 979, so almost 1,000 different respondents who are all IR scholars at different universities. Now, it's worth noting that these people are kind of ivory tower theorists. They maybe don't have as much information. They have, international relations theories. Like these are like my professors at Brown. I'm not 100% sure that we can trust them to exactly predict when China will invade or how likely war will be. But they do have some expertise. So these scholars seem to have a bit of a consensus that probably China is not going to invade Taiwan in the next year. Granted, this was a year old, so I guess they were right. Only 6% said that China would invade Taiwan in the next year. And none of them said that China would definitely invade Taiwan. On average, they estimated about a 23% chance that Chinese would have an attack against Taiwan. It's notable that also this prediction, the chance of this prediction has not risen very much compared to past years. And then they also estimated the likelihood of war between the US and China within 10 years, which is a very long time frame, is estimated to be about 24%. So it's slowly increased over time, but not very fast. Most of them still think that the chance is quite low. And war does not necessarily mean nuclear war either. So the overall compounding percent chance of the impact scenario that the Aff usually discusses being true if we continue on the status quo, I think is quite low if we take this card at face value. This card says that it's not inevitable. It's not as good, but Yeah, I don't know. You could read it. This is the second card that I think is really good. This is another meta-analysis. So the first one was like 1,000 different IR professors or IR experts. This one takes every single available forecast, which is all scholars doing forecasts as well. And it does a meta-analysis of all of those scholarly forecasts. And it says, like, nah, like the 2027 timeline, for example, that's not going to happen. Um, Even though the military people think that it might. None of the scholars really believe that it will happen. They say this is like a big indictment as well. It gives three different reasons why the more aggressive predictions from the military are probably wrong and are overestimating the chance of war. And it really emphasizes the fact that even though the risk of war is growing, like that seems undeniable, it is growing from an incredibly low baseline. So the chance of war did not start very high in the first place. So even though it's risen a little bit, like if you multiply the chance of war by 10, if it started at 0.1%, it still ends at 1%, which is still very low. So that's the main thesis of this article, and it gives a lot of reasons why you should doubt all of the predictions that say it will happen in 2027, for example. The alarmist narratives are completely wrong. They make bad assumptions. They heavily exaggerate a lot of things, and they're wrong. It even says at the bottom that even the scholarly forecasts, which already predict a very low chance of war, are probably overestimating the chance of war themselves because they are also situated within, tangential to the military, or they only look at military calculations without looking at as many of the economic consequences, which should on their own be enough to deter China as well, and at the very least would further subtract from the low level of risk that is estimated by the forecasts. It says at the very end, a mix of military and economic deterrence can effectively prevent conflict even in the future. So this is not just next year. This is not just by 2027. This is far into the future as well. So I think this is the single best piece of uniqueness that the neg could read on the issue of US-China war. It also accounts, it's mostly about Taiwan as well. So it's good to know. This next one says that a lot of the military speculations are wrong. This one is really interesting. It's very different from the other uniqueness evidence that I just read you, but it pairs really well with them. It talks about three things that China would need before they consider an intentional invasion of Taiwan. One, it says that it would need to rapidly divest itself from Western investments. It would need to drop all of its holdings of US treasuries, for example, in order to make sure that that won't be used against it for economic coercion in the event that it does attack. Second is that it will have to stockpile much more food. Right now, it's sitting at about 60% production of its domestic food, or yeah, I think so. And then it imports like 33% of its food. And the article says that in order for Xi Jinping to feel at all comfortable invading, it will have to be much greater than 66% self-sufficiency for food. Otherwise, there is a very real risk that sanctions that are triggered across the international community could just starve out China. And this is the same reasoning for the third argument, which is that it needs to stockpile much more crude oil. Otherwise, like right now, it only has about 2 months of crude oil if the international community cuts it off after an invasion of Taiwan, which is certainly not enough. So it would want to build that up much more, which would likely take years before it would consider an invasion of Taiwan. These three things mean, one, China will have to spend a few years if it wants to invade Taiwan to do these preparations. And two, if China does invade Taiwan, we will know well in advance because it will do these things and these will be public information. The fact that it's not doing these things right now shows that probably there is very, very low risk of war in the near future. It does say this directly. It says the probability of an all-out war over Taiwan is thus currently very low. And it concludes that the more pressing danger is some sort of accidental conflict or miscalculation. So I think it pairs really well with some of the other analysis on uniqueness. And then finally, this card is maybe more of an Aff card. It says Taiwan is still the most likely scenario for a US-China war. So there aren't a lot of alt causes. Like the other things that might trigger a US-China war in the absence of Taiwan just probably won't. Like it's like either we're going to go to war over Taiwan or we're not going to go to war. Um, and it also makes the same argument that we've heard before, which is that any perceived push by Taiwan or by the US for Taiwan toward Taiwan independence would cause the CCP to have to do an invasion, even if it thinks it will lose, because the alternative would be an existential decline in legitimacy. Like it's possible that the CCP would not be able to hold on to power if it refused that provocation, if it refused to stand up to an invasion and do an invasion of Taiwan in the event of a perceived declaration of independence, which is really important domestic political context that does not figure into a lot of the military calculations that realists are doing in literature. The final update, the fifth update for today, is that I cut way more headlines. I guess I didn't really cut them. I cut two, but I found a bunch of new headlines on October 29th. So I added this at the top. These are not headlines. These are just the different stories that I'm following. So this is like a brief summary of all of the things that might appear in this document. But I'll go through some of the main points. For Taiwan, nothing is much happening. They booted some Coast Guard ships from China out of like Kinmen. This is a good opportunity to talk about Taiwanese geography. They have So the main island of Taiwan is already very close to China, but they have a bunch of outlying islands as well, that are even closer, like right on, like just a couple kilometers off of the coast of China. The one that's closest is Kinmen, which has a military base from Taiwan on it as well. And then it also has the Matsu Islands. These islands are islands that China frequently sails ships around. This is not much of a new development, really. But I guess it's worth noting that this has happened recently. The Taiwan patrol has driven out for Chinese Coast Guard ships from around Kinmen. Otherwise, the foreign minister has been on a tour in Latin America. They have like 11 allies. Taiwan has 11 formal allies because China keeps bullying all of its other allies away from formal diplomatic relations. But most of them are microstates, like little island nations like St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And China has recently been trying to stop it from establishing better relations with Guatemala. So interesting to know about. The biggest development that you should know, which is very relevant to the topic, is this, which is that the US just approved new arms sales to Taiwan just a few days ago that value just under $2 billion. Specifically, they include most of the money is for new like air defense missile systems, which are very high class. They're better than anything Taiwan has right now. They cost a lot of money, and they were used successfully in Ukraine as well. The rest of the money, like $800 million or so, was set aside for improving their radar programs, which actually I want to talk about. It opens the door for an interesting neg argument that could be used as like a disadvantage in rebuttal, for example, or even its own contention, which is about intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance efforts, or ISR, which could be used if we continue upgrading the radar systems in Taiwan. So the idea is this. U.S. military support for Taiwan comes in the forms of arms sales that strengthen the radar of Taiwan. That strengthens ISR capabilities, which allows it to get more information about the capabilities and movements of the Chinese military, because Taiwan is uniquely situated geographically very close to the Chinese military and to the Chinese Navy activities. It shares that information with the U.S. and it also uses it itself. It is very important to have all of this information because this information allows you to avoid accidents and avoid things like miscalculation because you're able to get a better sense for all of the different things that are happening in the region. It also helps with deterrence because you maybe are able to sense the movements that China is doing ahead of time. Why is continued military support necessary? One, you need to continue upgrading the radar because then it gets better. Scalar improvements in ISR capabilities means that you have a scalar improvement in the ability to prevent war and prevent miscalculation. But two is that China might be able to do things like cyber attacks or other sabotage activities to erode the capabilities of the radar if the radar does not continue being upgraded to keep up with the developments in cyber technology as well. So it's possible that without a more resilient radar in the future, China has extra reasons that it is able to exploit this vulnerability to blind Taiwan and blind the US to its capabilities around the island, which might then result in miscalculation or accidents. So an interesting argument that seems like very independent from everything else in the neg that you could run if you prep it. And then, of course, China has responded to the new arms sales. It's worth noting that these arms sales are pretty significant. Like the last arms sales that the US has been approving have been in the scale of like $300 to $500 million. This one is $2 billion. That's much bigger. And so you would expect a bigger reaction from China. Ironically, China's reaction, in my opinion, hasn't been as big as I would have expected. Like, sure, it's like sent some jets around Taiwan. It sent some warships around Taiwan. Those exercises are not anywhere near the recent exercises that happened a few weeks ago after President Lai's National Day speech. They existed and then they stopped. It's not even happening anymore. It seems like a bit of a muted reaction to me. Of course, they got angry at the US. They said, hey, stop that, like they always do. But nothing more has come from it. So it seems like kind of a dub. Other news about China, stuff about its economy. Economy is not doing great, but it's considering stimulus in a major way for the first time. It has some scuffles about trade with the EU, specifically about automobiles, and the US is continuing to try to restrict high tech like sharing of information with China or imports to China. So it's doing more export restrictions, especially with regard to AI. North Korea is increasingly involved in the Ukraine conflict. They have the reports have been confirmed that they have sent troops to Russia, and those troops are currently on a train to the Kursk Oblast, or some of them maybe have already gotten to the Kursk Oblast, which is this oblast right here, very close to the Ukraine border. It doesn't seem like they have yet actually been involved in fighting on the ground with Ukrainian soldiers, but that seems to be well on its way, inevitable at this point. And there's a lot of other news about Ukraine that doesn't involve North Korea. It's a very bloody conflict, lots of strikes on both sides, but especially against Ukraine, and a lot of people dying. Okay, good to know about. Iran. The latest on Iran is that Israel responded to Iran's earlier attack with like a missile strike of its own, or multiple missile strikes of its own near the capital. However, they spared two important targets, nuclear reactors and the oil fields and like energy stores of Iran. People actually expected them to maybe attack these things, which is why oil prices spiked, because people expected and priced in preemptively a decrease in supply while demand has only continued to rise, which would have increased oil prices precipitously. But instead, oil prices have fallen back down because Israel maybe surprisingly spared these things. And it seems like there's a lot of mixed headlines about this. Some people are speculating this is going to escalate to a wider war. Some people are actually more optimistic and say, actually, no, it's going to be contained, and we don't have to have an inevitability of an Iran-Israel full-blown war, especially not one that draws in the US, but things are mixed. I think there are slightly more optimistic headlines than pessimistic headlines when it comes to the prospects of all-out war in the Middle East, though, which seems good. Saudi Arabia is continuing trying to restore its dwindling economy. It's also aiming for a World Cup bid, despite human rights abuses, and it's trying to forge more relations in the region. Plus, it's negotiating more with Iranian diplomats to avoid destabilizing the region, which is a good development. South China Sea, same as always. There are disputes that are happening, potential for military conflict. China is continuing to fortify its new radar systems on the Triton Island, and that's about it. Nothing super new in the South China Sea. Something very new, however, in Japan is that they just had elections, and for the first time in a very, very long time, the majority party, the LDP, which was the ruling coalition, has lost its majority. The prime minister is still from that party, Ishiba, and it's one of the first times in a very long time that the prime minister has been from a party that does not have a clear majority in parliament. And so now they have to figure out where their future lies amid a lot of political turmoil, which will contextualize any scenario that anyone reads about Japan. Georgia also had elections. I just threw this in here, even though it's probably irrelevant to the topic because they were very controversial. And the pro-EU party that was the opposition lost, and they're now accusing the anti-EU party of winning because they've, have cheated the election, possibly with Russian help or Russian interference. I also decided to prep some headlines about China and the US cooperating. It seems like cooperation is mixed. There are reasons to be optimistic about some cooperation. There are reasons to be pessimistic about other cooperation. A lot of it has started or restarted and then stopped and then started and then stopped. But some of it seems very good. Like, for example, the cooperation against fentanyl and narcotics has been going very well. It's definitely a success story. But maybe some of the cooperation on technology sharing and, climate change is not going quite as well, even though it is going, which is at least good for some uniqueness. military talks specifically, or hotlines, have recently restarted, but they're also rocky amid arms sales. South Korea is trying to maybe step into helping Ukraine, given that North Korea is now hurting Ukraine, possibly with arms sales, but they have domestic laws that prevent them from doing so. So they're reviewing them right now and weighing whether or not they want to change their domestic laws in order to allow themselves to get involved in the Ukraine conflict, which could cause it to escalate. There are also two civil wars that you should know about that are quite terrible. Sudan is possibly the worst civil war that is currently existing on the planet. Tons of people are dying. There are pretty credible reports of ethnic cleansing, especially in the Darfur region. And it is just horrible, and very few people are talking about it. It's been called a forgotten crisis. So not great. I don't know if it has a link to the topic, but it definitely has a link to other international relations. It is not an isolated incident, so maybe you can find one. Myanmar also has a civil war, much closer to the region that we're talking about. Specifically, it has a lot of implications on neighboring Thailand, as well as China, who is loosely involved with friendly relations with the Myanmar junta, but distancing themselves much more. Specifically, the ethnic Rohingya community is facing very grave threats, and lots of people are dying. It's quite bad. There's a lot of authoritarian tendencies and, killings of journalists and things like that. Okay, so that's everything that I have for news, and that's the fifth and last update that I have for you. I will release one more video in which I roast all of the arguments that I have written, which hopefully includes a lot of arguments that will become pretty stock on the topic. And I'll talk through, I think, the best strategies for building blocks and building block files in general. But hopefully this was helpful, and good luck in your tournaments.